Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are doing well. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys. Looking forward to all being together with not just us, but also bringing the girls. I'm hopeful that this time the girls will not be throwing up, as that happened at the end of or on our way down to class last time. So I'm looking forward to being there with you guys and all of those different things soon. So what we're doing this morning is we are going to be talking about and wrapping up our book on Kings. As you know, we've been studying the book of Kings for a while now. I think this is the 33rd class that we've had, so it's been quite a journey, which makes sense. Kings, when we include 1st and 2nd Kings, is one of the longer books in the Bible. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's good to have kind of a conclusion chapter, conclusion class to think through all of the different things that we've learned. As we think through where we've been and where we are going next. Speaking of where we are going next, if you recall, starting next week, we're going to be getting into the book of 2nd Peter. We're going to go to 2nd Peter first, and then Jude. If you would like to, something that might be useful to do is just kind of read through 1st and 2nd Peter once. Don't really try to get everything. We've just gone through 1st Peter not too long ago with David. He did a great job in that class. I'm not going to review all that. We're going to be starting in 2nd Peter, but just to kind of familiarize yourself with the story. If you read Jude, it's only one chapter. That can be helpful too. You'll see there's a lot of similarities between 2nd Peter and Jude. We'll talk about some of that, but all we're planning on doing next week is just kind of getting an idea of the lay of the land, talk about how we're going to go through things, get an idea of where we're at, that kind of an issue. So with that said, let's get started in our study here in the book of Kings. So we have not seen this in a while, but I wanted to kind of revisit it to kind of see where we were at. And if you remember, this is the outline of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings that we've discussed before. And we've mentioned that one of the things that it does is that the book of Kings is presented in a chiasm, or a story arc tipped on its side, as a friend of mine likes to call them. And what this does is it shows us what we are interested and focused on. So, for example, at the very beginning of Kings, for the first 11 chapters, it's a united kingdom under a Judahite king, a son of David, whose name here is Solomon. But that doesn't last. What we have is that the northern kingdom is created. You remember the situation that the prophet comes to Solomon and says, comes to Rehoboam and says, because of the sins of your father, I'm taking away the kingdom from him. And he gives 10 tribes to Jeroboam the first, the king of Israel. And what happens, we have this short little section between chapters 15 and chapter 16 that just kind of goes back and forth between those kings, after focusing on the kings of the north. But the center, the key, the most important part of the book of Kings is what happens right there at the end of chapter 16 of Kings, 1st Kings, and moving in through the middle of 2nd Kings, and that is Ahab's family. Ahab is a wicked king of the north, and he interacts with the most famous prophets of the book of Kings. He interacts with Elijah and Elisha. And it's in this text that we spent most of our time on, really, in the book of Kings, that we see so many crucial, important factors that we'll talk a little bit about more this morning, but that discuss why it is that God has destroyed his people, why it is that God is going to destroy Israel and Judah. So we go back then into this back and forth discussion of kings between the north and the south there in 2 Kings chapters 13 through 16. But then in chapter 17 we see the destruction of the northern kingdom. And we're going to see the destruction, as we'll mention in just a minute, that it has the same root cause as the destruction that we see happens at the end of Judah. And just as God has brought a kingdom to pass, and that God has brought judgment on Judah, because of the sins of Solomon, even though it happened during the time of his son Rehoboam, so too we're going to see that God is bringing judgment against Judah because of the sin of Manasseh. But it's going to happen later. It doesn't happen at that time. And that's because there's this thread that works through the book of Kings. And that thread that plays through the book of Kings is centered around Egypt. Now, that may seem kind of an odd thing to say, but let me see if I can explain it a little bit. It's from the very beginning of the Bible, Egypt has been set up as an alternative to God. Egypt is the thing that you trust in when you do not trust in God. Let's think about this for a second. Let's consider some examples. Let's think about in the very, very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. You remember, of course, who the first kind of progenitor of Israel is. It's Abraham, right? And Abraham in chapter 12, right after he's called by God to come out of, as we'll discuss in a minute, Babylon, and he's going to come to Israel, and God says, I'm going to give you this land, and I'm going to give you a people, and I'm going to give you a promise, and everything's going to be great, and you're not supposed to leave this land. That as soon as that happens, what is the first thing he does? He goes down to Egypt. Why does he go down to Egypt in Genesis chapter 12? Because he doesn't trust that God can provide in a famine. Instead, he trusts in Egypt, he trusts in its productivity, he trusts in the Nile, and he goes down to Egypt, and bad things happen. But it's not just there. In the very next chapter, he comes back, and he's got his nephew Lot with him, and their shepherds are fighting over land, and Abraham said, look, we shouldn't be fighting, we're relatives. Look, you will divide the land, here's the left, here's the right, which one do you want? And Lot picks the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're like, okay. But what's easy to miss is it says he picks the land of Sodom and Gomorrah because it looks like Egypt. He puts his trust in Egypt rather than trust in God. Of course, how does that happen, right? We know what happens to him in Sodom and Gomorrah. We know what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah. A little bit later, in Genesis chapter 16, just a few chapters later, remember, Abraham is supposed to have all these descendants. Abraham is supposed to have all these children, but he doesn't. And he's come up with some schemes, and his wife comes up with a scheme. She says, hey, I have a handmaid, Hagar. You go into her. She is fertile. She'll have children, and that's how we're going to help. We're going to fulfill God's promises. But do you remember where Hagar is from? She's from Egypt. Again, trusting in Egypt rather than trusting in God. And we know how all of that worked out as well. Later in Genesis chapter 26, God tells Isaac, don't go down to Egypt. And he doesn't, but he does the next best thing and goes over to the king of Abimelech. So throughout Genesis, we see that Egypt is held up as an alternative to God, something that you can put your trust in that looks good, that's human, that's rich, that's productive, that's fertile, and people don't put their trust in God. Well, then we're going to see the same thing happen in the book of Exodus, right? Remember how often in Exodus do the people say, look, we'd better be dead in Egypt than to come out here. We don't trust that God can protect us from the Egyptians. We should go back to Egypt. It was better for us in Egypt. Remember if we ate leeks and vegetables and meat in Egypt. I wish we died in Egypt. Let's have new rulers to bring us back to Egypt. The same thing, of course, happens in the book of Numbers. And in Joshua chapter 24, you know, that famous text where he says, as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. Well, he also says, choose now who you're going to serve, whether it's the gods of Egypt that your fathers served. Again, he says, what's the option? Who are we going to serve? Are you going to build your own golden calves like they have in Egypt? Or are you going to serve the Lord? And we're going to see it in the book of Kings as well, that this is the same option that they're going to have. But it's not just there, it's that Egypt represents other things as well, because remember what happens to them when they're in Egypt. That there's a new Pharaoh that arises that does not know Joseph, doesn't care about what he's done, doesn't provide for the people. And what does he do? He enslaves God's people first, forcing them to make the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. He Then, of course, after that doesn't work, he commands the Israel midwives to kill the boys. He eventually enlists all of Egypt in destroying God's people, destroying the firstborn, destroying all the sons. And it stands that here he is setting himself up as a god, because remember, pharaohs didn't just think they were kings, they thought that they were gods. And he sets himself up against the Lord. That's what happens, of course, in the Exodus. But you remember what happens in the Exodus, that God says, I've heard my people's groaning, and I'm going to save them. And he gives them a promise, and he fulfills them this promise, not because the Israelites in Egypt are good or righteous. In fact, as we know from Joshua in Joshua 24, they're idolaters. He saves them because he gave their fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a promise. And he's going to fulfill that promise. It's God who sends the destroyer to take out the Egyptian firstborn. It's God who brings the plagues. It's God who sends the lambs that are going to be slaughtered. It's God who pays the price to redeem his children. And because of that, Egypt is set up as a place of exile. Now, of course, Egypt is not really exile in the same way as we might think of it, and as we're going to see Babylon as exile. But it's representative for it, because there they are across the river, and God has promised that he's going to bring them back. And God says, this is why you cannot go to Egypt for anything. Don't go there for horses. Don't go there for chariots. Don't go back to Egypt ever, because I brought you out, and I don't want you going back. That going back to Egypt, as we're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 28, that is a punishment. That is doom. That is exile. That is their destruction. But now that we've kind of got that in our minds, we can see these four different elements are not just present in Genesis. They're not just present in Exodus. They're not just present in Numbers. They're not just present in Joshua. They are also present in the book of Kings. And it's something that's not just present in the book of Kings, it is an emphasis in the book of Kings. It is a focus in the book of Kings that I've tried to, as we've kind of gone through it slowly, to kind of point these things out. But I think it's useful here at the end of our class to spend a few minutes and focus on a little bit more. That the very first king that we read about really starting to become king in the book of Kings, of course, Solomon. What's the first thing really we read about him doing? It's in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Egypt when he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David. The very first thing we do is he's going to go down to Egypt, and he does it for power. He does it because he thinks it can provide him. He does it because he thinks that's what's going to give him peace, rather than trusting in the Lord. But it's not just there, right? It's not just this one situation. Is that we see it in the rest of Solomon's life as well, that Solomon kind of becomes a pharaoh. In chapter 9, 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 19, we read that he makes the Israelites slaves of sorts, indentured slaves, but still slaves, and he forces them to build store cities. And the Hebrew word for these store cities only occurs one other time in the entire Bible, and it's in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, where Pharaoh makes the Israelites build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. That he acts like Pharaoh. We read in chapter 10, verses 26 through 29 of 1 Kings, that he imports horses from Egypt. And that even in the other little bits of his life, we might not think that it's so clear, except for all the other kind of connections to Egypt. But when we see these two prostitutes that come before Solomon, and he threatens to kill the baby in half, that this is kind of representative of the kingdom itself. It's represented in some ways of Egypt, who is going to kill its children. But it's not just Solomon that fits this role. It's also, of course, that Jeroboam functions as a Moses-like character who flees to Egypt and is given the daughter of Pharaoh as his wife. And he's a new Moses who comes out of the land. He's going to go to Solomon and say, let my people go. He wants to free Israel from Solomon's pharaonic-like slavery. But of course, what does Jeroboam do once he becomes in power? The first thing he does is he builds golden calves, just like they do in the Exodus coming out of Egypt. So it's a real problem, where Israel tries to be like Egypt, who thinks that being like Egypt is going to give them power, who thinks that being Egypt is going to give them what they need, is going to protect them, that the people of the north won't get rid of the golden calves because they trust in the golden calves, not in the Lord. But it's not just in those situations either. It's that the nation is going to seek Egypt rather than God as well. What do I mean by that? That if we go to 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7, this is the 2 Kings chapter 17, if you remember from the outline we had up in just a moment ago, it's when the northern kingdom is destroyed. The northern kingdom is, of course, is at war with Assyria. And Assyria is powerful. But in whom does Israel trust to save it? Do they repent? Do they get rid of the golden calves? Do they trust in God? No. What do? We read in 2 Kings verse 17:7, this occurred, the destruction of Israel, because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, out from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. Well, what is the final straw that happens is that the king of Assyria finds out that they have sent messengers to try to get an alliance with whom? Take a guess. With Egypt. You know, the commenter Paul House said, the people forgot the Exodus and all that it stood for, God's power and grace, and that God acts on their behalf, and the responsibility to reciprocate God's goodness with faith, undivided allegiance, pure worship. Instead, they worshipped local deities. They adopted corrupt ethical principles, and they ignored the Lord's prophets who were sent to warn them. And this is made explicit because all throughout chapter 7, in chapter 17, verse 8, in chapter 17, verse 17, in chapter 17, verse 10, verse 12, verse 15, verse 16, verse 17, over and over and over and over, we read that what they do is they trust in Egypt. They make gods like the Egyptians. They acted like the Canaanites. And they're going to be destroyed because of it. And we think, well, okay, that's just northern Israel. Except it's not just northern Israel. The very next chapter in the book of 2 Kings, it's 2 Kings chapter 18. And you can, if you want, you can flip over there to remind yourself what's going on. But to give you the short version, since we're, just talking through a screen and I can't actually call on you, is that it's finds us with the King Hezekiah, king of Judah. And Hezekiah, like the north, is fighting against Assyria. And Hezekiah, like the north, thinks that he can survive because he has trusted in Egypt. Remember the Rabshakeh, the general of Assyria, comes up against the wall and he's shouting to Hezekiah. And he says, hey, God's brought me to destroy you because you have trusted in Egypt. Now Hezekiah, thankfully, right, because otherwise Judah would have been destroyed right there, Hezekiah repents, he goes to the temple, he prays, and God saves them by sending, what? The destroyer, like in Egypt, right? To wipe out the Assyrian threat. But before then, he has absolutely trusted in Egypt. And that the Judah is going to seek Egypt at the very end as well. That what did we just talk about last class? But where did the people place their trust over and over and over in the last few kings? In Egypt. And it's that trust in Egypt that leads to the destruction of Judah by Babylon. That Egypt is the last straw. That God says, you have trusted in Egypt rather than me, so I will destroy you. But it's not just Egypt. It's also that they're like Pharaoh. We've already mentioned that Solomon becomes like Pharaoh, but it's also Ahab. Ahab is like Pharaoh. We're like, how is Ahab like Pharaoh? That we read in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 2. Remember when he destroys and kills off Naboth, the innocent Israelite? He does it so that he can plant a vegetable garden. It's a rare word in biblical Hebrew. It's one that Deuteronomy says that's what Egypt looked like. And like the crowds that followed Moses to Egypt, Ahab wants to return to slavery and to idolatry. And it happens with the Exodus as well. Do you remember when we were talking about the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 6? That it occurs on 480th year from when? When does it record? From the Exodus. And that it's only when the temple is built that they truly have a land of rest, that God has given them rest from all their enemies, that God has made things where they have what they need, that it's only then that Exodus is recurring. And do you know how many years after the temple is built that Israel's going to be in the land? 480. And God says in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 64 through 68, we're not going to read the whole thing, but he says, and the Lord, if you keep on sinning, he's going to bring you in exile. And he says, and he will bring you in ships to Egypt, a journey that I promised you would never make again. And there you will bring yourself and offer yourself for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. And God's prayer, the temple dedication, is that he will bring them out of Egypt over and over and over again. What we have here then is this situation where Egypt is present throughout the text of the book of Kings. That it's not just every so often, it is predominant, it is all over the place, that it is present everywhere you look. And we have this Moses character also behind the text of Ahab as well, that he cries and he rescue him out from slavery, that these situations occur multiple times, and that all these things happen, and that God remembers his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob just as he has done there with Egypt. So Egypt is present throughout the text. And the choice then is there before the people. Will the people choose God, or will they choose Egypt? Whom will you serve? And I would suggest that's the same solution we have before us. That Egypt represented the best things of humanity. It was rich, it was powerful, it had a long history. The land was good. It was safe, generally speaking, from its enemies. It had culture. It had history. It had scholarship. Egypt was where you wanted to be. That if you're going to look around at the nation, you're like, you know what? I kind of want to be like Egypt. And that's what Israel wanted to be like. They wanted to be like all the other nations, and especially they wanted to be like Egypt. But they wanted to be like Egypt more than they wanted to be like God. And that's a problem. And God says, you really want to go back to Egypt? Fine. I will drag you into exile. And then we'll see if you like Egypt then. So we always have a choice ourselves. Are we going to trust in God? Are we going to trust in man? Are we going to trust in God? Are we going to trust in the things that Egypt looks like God? What's going to happen in that way? But it's not just Egypt. We also are going to see that the same thing happens with the different empire, of course, that we have. That the same thing is going to happen with Babylon. Now, Babylon is a little bit different. And what I mean by that is that what occurs for Babylon is that the story is a little bit different in that way and how things play out. But it does a similar thing. And what I mean by doing a similar thing is that we're going to see Babylon is present in multiple ways throughout the book of Kings. But it's more than just that. It's that Babylon has a really key part throughout the book of the Bible, throughout the whole story of God as a whole. And I think that we need to kind of look at that. So it's present in the very beginning of the Bible. It's present there in all the way back in Genesis. That it's in Genesis chapter 11. Now, we remember, of course, what occurs in Genesis chapter 11, that's the Tower of Babel. Now, it's not called Babylon there yet. The Tower of Babel is built on the plain of Shinar, but we see that it is present in the story. We see that what happens is, of course, that all of the people gather together, they all speak one language, and what do with them speaking one language? They all come together and they're planning on doing what? They want to build a tower in a city so that they can go up to God. Now, why are they trying to build a tower in a city that's going to go all the way up to God? It's because what they want to do is they want to attack God, right? We'd say, I guess, attack heaven. They want to destroy God, and they want to take this place that they want to do the kind of the same thing that Adam and Eve want to do. They want to become gods themselves. Well, how does God react to that, right? He destroys them. And he makes it so that they cannot do that. He destroys he goes down, he confuses their language, they spread all over the place, right? That shows them what they're gonna get, right? They don't get anything else from that situation. And the next story we get is Abraham, whom God brings out from where the where the Babylonians live. It's not the exact same people, but he's from Chaldea. It's that same kind of situation. And then God's story begins. But you can move forward in the story of Babylon as well, because the story of Babylon is kind of going to become the beginning and ending of God's people in a way. So Babylon is going to be the end of Israel because they're going to be the ones who destroy them. Now, the way that works is that the Book of Kings is, and we've talked about this before, so we talked about this in the very first class on the Book of Kings, that the Book of Kings is kind of the conclusion of this big section of loosely unified books that some people call the Deuteronomistic history. And they only call that because Deuteronomy has these two covenants, and it tells what the promises are going to happen if the people do good, and what's going to happen to them if the people do evil. And what it says is going to happen, right? We read this in Deuteronomy chapter 28, is that God will bring them into exile and bring them out of the land if they don't do what God says. Well, of course, what happens in the Book of Kings is exactly that, right? Is that they are destroyed and they are brought into exile. And it's not just the Book of Kings that kind of focuses on these things. You know, if you read in the Book of Judges, if you read in the books of Samuel, if you read in the books of Kings, you have all these other curses that Deuteronomy brings on the people for disobedience, right? Like if you're reading all those books and you're like, why are there so many stories about wild animals, like lions coming out of nowhere? It's because it's fulfilling some of the promises here in the Book of Kings. And so Babylon is the end of that. That Babylon is going to be the tool that God uses to destroy his people and fulfill the promises that he made all the way back in Deuteronomy 28. And so it kind of concludes that section, which is a major section there in the Book of Kings. But it's not just going to be that what he's also going to do is Babylon is going to be the way that we're going to, at least on the face of things, destroy God's promises to David about there always going to be a king in Israel. Remember God's promise there in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God comes to David and he says, one of your sons will always sit on the throne, and that I'll never take it away, and I'll never do anything wrong, and I'll be with him always, and I'll provide everything that he needs, and he'll be like a son to me, and I'll be a father to him. And all those things occur, and we think, well, God's always going to have a promise on the throne. Well, what do we read about occurring there all the way up to the last little epilogue in the Book of Kings? Is that the last king of Judah, Babylon takes out, and he kills all of his sons before him. And then he gouges out his eyes, and he kills him as well. And we think, that's it. The palace is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. The city is destroyed. There's no more king. God's promises have failed. But they haven't, of course, because we have that epilogue, that there is hope, that there is at least a Davidic line. There may not be a Davidic king, there may not be a king on the throne, but at least there's hope. And so kind of concluding then that story in the book of Kings is what we just see. But Babylon is not done yet there. It's not just that Babylon is destroying Judah and destroying everything. It's not just that Nebuchadnezzar is God's chosen instrument, that he ends up completing God's plan, that it's not actually that God has been defeated, but only Judah, because God wanted them to be defeated. It's present also at the very end of the Bible as well. And this is what I mean about Babylon and the story of God, that all the way back in Genesis chapter 11, we see the Tower of Babel. And remember again what we said, pride, joining together, trying to destroy the people of God. God comes down to this city, right, that is built, and he confuses their language and they scatter all over the place. Well, how does the book of Revelation end? Again, this whore of Babylon comes to attack God's people. But they are in a city, the New Jerusalem, the new heavens, and the new earth. And God defeats her again. But notice how that happens. That we read in Revelation 13, in other places of Revelation as well, I think it's chapter 7 or 8, the people of every nation and every tongue and every language will be praising God and the Lamb. The difference between the city of Babel and the New Jerusalem is that whereas in the city of Babel, anyone who doesn't speak the same language isn't of the same culture, it drives them to enmity, that in the new city, the New Jerusalem, they are all united. That Babel, the Tower of Babel, has been turned on its head. And that now this city is a good rather than a bad thing. And so even though Babylon seeks to wage war against God's people and against God himself, because that's what they did in Genesis. That's what Babylon does to Judah. That's what Babylon does to the kings. That Babylon destroys the temple. That what do we have? A new city, a new Jerusalem that cannot be destroyed by Babel, and that can't even have a temple that it's destroyed by Babel, because the whole thing is like a temple. And that God is in their midst. And that Babylon's power is broken. And that Babylon, for all that they are vaunted and think that they are the most powerful people around, they are nothing but a tool in God's hand. And they will be defeated. And God's people will be perfectly and completely safe. And that brings us to kind of the last thing I want to talk about this morning. And that is these three things that we've seen repeatedly in the book of Kings. These three themes that are really kind of one theme. We've seen the first one, that there's no king like David. How often every single king that we read about for the South is measured up against David. Does he do like David does or not? Does he do like David do except for this, or does he not? Or how often do we read that God is going to save Judah, or he remembers Judah, or he's going to protect Judah because of David? That this promise is there the whole time. And even though every king is measured against David, and all but two, Hezekiah and Josiah, are found to be pathetic, really, in a lot of ways, and even they fail to live up to David's, full caliber, there's going to be something there. And in the same way, we read of a whole lot of prophets in the book of Kings, more prophets than anybody, and a lot of them are explicitly connected to Moses, right? That Ahijah is like Moses, that Elijah is like Moses, that Elisha is like Moses. But aside from those, throw in Huldah and a few others, most of the prophets we actually read about in the Bible, in the book of Kings, are bad prophets. They don't do what Moses does. They can't really save Judah. They can't really get the kings to change. They can't really save the people through praying to God. They're not as good as Moses. And the priests, they're even worse. With just a few exceptions, they're all bad. They're not like Phineas, who averts the wrath of God by destroying the wicked doers. Instead, they're the ones who are kissing up to the king whenever the king is doing something bad. They're the ones who are serving in the high places. They're the ones who are serving other gods, even in the temple. They're selfish. They're divided. None bring the people back to God. They fail horribly. And if you want to know kind of how the book of Kings, if we were going to use a New Testament text to explain the book of Kings, it would be this. It's what Paul says. That all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. One commentator said this. It said that in the book of Kings, it's not just that there's no pantheon of gods or a hierarchy of gods or those sorts of things. He says, there aren't even mythical human heroes. No character who has to fool God into doing something God doesn't want to do. No hero or heroine who seems greater than mere mortals. In fact, quote, even the best humans of 1st and 2nd Kings are frail, fallible, and prone to make costly errors. They fear death. They betray others. In fact, even the best humans, right? They sin in their old age. They fight battles they cannot win. Instead, what we have present in the book of Kings are real people, real nations, real events that populate these very real accounts. And this is right. Everyone in the book of Kings sins, even the characters who are best. David and Solomon, Joash and Uzziah, Hezekiah and Josiah, they all sin. There is no easier way to tell this than what we looked at a little bit as we went through the book of Kings, but sometimes we'll have to go through the book of Chronicles as well and compare how Solomon and David, how Josiah and Hezekiah, how Joash or Asa are treated in the books of Chronicles versus the book of Kings. Now, these are not contradictory or conflicting accounts, but what they do is they're emphasizing different things. And the book of Kings, at every junction, emphasizes the sins of these otherwise good people, except for Solomon. So, in the book of Chronicles, we don't have David and Bathsheba. In the book of Chronicles, we don't have Solomon's apostasy at the end of his age. In the book of Chronicles, we don't have the same sort of sins from Hezekiah. We have far greater emphasis on Asa and Joash and all these other things. The difference is obvious. And the point of the book of Kings is meant to explain why the people are in exile. And the reason they're in exile is because all have sinned. No one is righteous. No, not one. But the point of the book of Kings is not to make us hopeless. And the reason is that the book of Kings is not hopeless because the book of Kings is certain and convinced and absolutely has shown that our God, although they are in exile, although there is no temple, although there are no high priest, all these problems, is that although the people are at that point hopeless, God is not helpless. And it ends with a glimmer of hope, and it ends with this longing and this focus on exile and what exile can do. You think about the book of Kings ends with all the people being dragged into Babylon and having to live there, and that Judah's fall and the subsequent exile, and is in a lot of ways kind of one of the most important signposts in the entire Bible. It's devastating. It's the most devastating thing that Moses can threaten the people with in Deuteronomy chapter 27 through 28. It's what Israel barely avoids at the end of the book of Judges. It's what Samuel himself warns people is going to happen if they get a king in 1 Samuel chapter 12. It's what Solomon prays that God will forgive them of in 1 Kings chapter 8. It's what Isaiah predicts in Isaiah chapter 39. It's what Jeremiah predicts in Jeremiah chapter 7. It's what Ezekiel predicts in Ezekiel chapter 20. Amos and Micah and Habakkuk and Zephaniah, they all predict exile, and they all see exile as one of the most important defining moments in all of the Old Testament's history. And it ends in exile. But that's not hopeless either. And it's not hopeless because of that connection that we saw at the very, very beginning of the book. And that is that the book of Kings has portrayed Egypt as exile. And the book of Kings says you have been in exile before, but God has brought you out. And so even though you may be in Babylon for 4 generations, which they won't be, but he says even if, then God can bring you out of here as well. But if they're going to really leave exile, what they really truly need is they need a new king who is even greater than David. They need a new prophet who is even greater than Moses. And a new priest that is even greater than Phineas. And if all those things come together, then and only then will they leave exile. The book of Kings then is a Messianic book. It looks forward to Jesus. If you read any of the Gospels, then it shows that Israel, even though they're back in the land, feels as though they're still in exile. But Mark begins with the new Exodus, and says that now that Christ is here, we are not in exile any longer. Of course, as we're going to see in the book of 2 Peter, that it's addressed to those of us, Christians in exile, because our true home is not on earth, but it is with God. And He too will come and bring us to something better, that He will create a new heavens and a new earth, that He will create a new home, a new promised land, a new Canaan, a new Jerusalem, where our exile will be over. And we will serve a king who is greater than David, a prophet who is greater than Moses, and a priest who is greater than Phineas. And in that, we can all rejoice. I hope the book of Kings has been profitable for you. I hope that its study has been useful for you to see these things and how they play throughout their lives and how they are, of course, I think, in a lot of ways, very connected to us living in our own exile. And I think that'll provide a good background, not just for David's study in Isaiah that I've really been enjoying on Wednesday nights. I hope that you've been enjoying that as well. But also in some ways, because of that focus on exile imagery, it's going to really tie in a lot of ways, I think, to the book of 2 Peter and Jude, which we'll get started on then next week. Have a blessed day. Look forward to seeing you guys at worship services.